Hello, everyone. We are giving a couple of minutes for everyone to join, and we will kickstart at 9:35. So thanks for your patience. Hi, team. We will start in 1 minute. Thanks for your patience. Josh, you can kickstart. We are on the time. We can kickstart now.
All right, great. So Ashwin, do you want to kind of introduce us and kick things off?
Sure. Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our virtual India Sumo Logic Cert Jam for security today. It's day 2 for us. However, I know that all of you must be busy because of the kind of cyber attack that we are seeing in terms of Log4j. But again, thank you so much for joining. There could be no better day than today to learn new things about security. So yeah, so we have Josh who's going to lead, who's going to be the lead instructor for you today. And along with me, we have Poonam and Suresh who's going to assist him. Poonam leads the customer success for India, and Suresh is a solution architect. I am leading the sales for West and South India region, and going forward, I'll assist the team in anything going forward in this search app. So over to you, Josh and Poonam. Let's kickstart this day.
Great, thanks, Ashwin. So welcome, everybody. Let me go ahead and turn my camera. I'll probably turn it off in a little bit, but there we go. So, hey, everybody. My name is Josh Brothheim. I'm the training manager at Sumo Logic. I met some of you yesterday. Good to see some of you back. I think there's some new people here as well. And we're going to be together for the next 3 hours. And as Ashwin mentioned, Poonam's going to be assisting today. And maybe Suresh if he pops in. So if there's any questions for today, go ahead and put in the chat or the Q&A if anything comes up. Very similar to how we did yesterday. Let's begin. I am going to turn off my camera. My bandwidth was being a little weird earlier, so but let's jump into it. So what we're going to be doing today is specifically talking about Cloud SIEM fundamentals. If you joined us yesterday, we talked about the fundamentals of Sumo Logic. What is a query? What is a dashboard? How does data get into Sumo Logic and other stuff? Today, what we're going to be focusing is on Cloud SIEM fundamentals. Cloud SIEM is it's not a different product. I guess we'll discuss in a few moments exactly what it is, but it's going to be a great way, as Ashwin referenced, with attacks going on all the time. It's important to get up-to-date information about your environments, about your systems, about things that might be occurring in them. And this is a great tool that's going to help us with that. For the agenda, similar to how we did yesterday, today will be similar in that we're together for 3 hours. The first 2 hours are going to be devoted to the labs, the presentation, some slides, things like that. And then we've set aside for an hour for that exam. So those of you that took that exam yesterday, and I see there's actually a question in the chat about it, will have the ability to earn a reward with us. So if you took the exam yesterday and passed it, and take one today and pass it, you're eligible for 2 rewards. If you did not send in for yours yesterday, you can do them both today. It doesn't really matter. But ultimately, what we want to do is we want to reward you for participating. So if you take your exam and pass it, and send us the certificate, as it says right here, with your job title, we'll provide you with a $10 Swiggy voucher. So certainly encourage everybody to take advantage of that, and I'll post it up later, and we'll talk about the exam later as well. I see many of you attended from yesterday, but I think there's a few new ones here, and so we'll talk about that exam later. Just don't worry about it too much. Let's go ahead and just review. Let's jump in here. So today's topic is Cloud SIEM fundamentals. So what is Cloud SIEM? So Cloud SIEM is a cloud-based enterprise-grade security information and event management system. And so that's what SIEM stands for, Security Information and Event Management System. Cloud SIEM leverages Sumo Logic's core functionality, including data collection, ingestion, storage, and threat intelligence. And we talked about some of that yesterday as far as the Sumo Logic core functionality of the data collection, the ingestion. We've talked about the threat intelligence portion, but the bringing in of data. And so many of that portion from yesterday will be relevant today. Cloud SIEM is a purchased add-on with an ever-expanding library of content that's designed for security operations. And since it's designed for large data volumes, many organizations need to ingest a large amount of data each day for insights to surface in Cloud SIEM. I'll talk about that process throughout the day. Now, this is an example of what the pipeline looks like. Cloud SIEM is a pretty powerful tool. It's going to take millions of log messages and funnel them down into a handful of actionable security insights. And so how does that work? Basically, at the very top, like we discussed yesterday with ingestion and collection, your logs are going to be, went too fast there. The logs are going to be collected and ingested by Sumo Logic into messages. Then once they're collected, and we saw a little bit of this yesterday on the log side thing, the logs, or in this case, those messages, are going to be parsed, mapped, and enriched and turned into Cloud SIEM records. And so we saw parsing yesterday as a way of taking data that's been ingested and locating fields and identifying those fields as values, essentially, or having values. So the system is going to take those messages that get ingested, parse them, enrich them, map them, turn them into Cloud SIEM records. Once they're turned into records, these records are going to be compared to rules. If a rule is triggered, then an entity is going to be extracted, and we'll talk about what an entity is shortly. And a severity score is also going to be assigned, and then a signal will be created. So from those records, they get compared to rules. If the rules match or trigger, really, then potentially a signal will be created. Now, if you have enough signals with the same cluster together, then they become an insight. What we're going to be focusing today on is the later stages of this pipeline, particularly the rules and investigations. So really the bottom half of this diagram. The top half is something that we focus on in the Cloud SIEM administration class. So like we did fundamentals yesterday, administration is more advanced. And so that would be the focus for the top portion. But we're focusing on the bottom portion today. So essentially records that get turned in or triggered into signals, and then taking those signals and turning them into insights and doing something with them. Now to go a little bit deeper, let's say we have a company. In this case, our company is going to be Sumo Logic Coffee. And Sumo Logic Coffee is going to collect, or does collect, and ingest millions of log messages into Sumo Logic. Now, typically, you can use these messages right away in many Sumo Logic apps like we saw yesterday. But not necessarily, but to use them in the Cloud SIEM enterprise, your admin is going to need to enable data forwarding. Your admin is also going to need to create log mappings, field extraction rules, and complete other pre-processing steps to extract the right data. And once again, that's focused on in the administration class. Now, before Cloud SIEM can generate security insights, the log messages must go through a little processing first, as we were talking about, or I was describing. So Cloud SIEM is going to process the messages, turn them into records. And then each record will contain the information from a message, which is parsed into key value pairs. Once again, those key value pairs come up again. And those are going to be mapped to Cloud SIEM schema and enriched with other data. So let's look at a example of this. So what we have here is a simple log message that's kind of come down this pipeline of what we just described, the collection, the parsing, all that stuff. So what we have here is first a message is parsed and extracted from the record. Then what is going to happen is it's going to be mapped into a set of key value pairs. Now this process is also going to fix basic formatting. This step is really going to create semi-structured data. So for example, here we have the value of IP-127-0-0-1. Well, when we put it through the basic formatting, this mapping step, this parsing step, excuse me, the parsing step was going to extract that IP address into that key value pair. And so now what we have is something that's more normalized, where we have source device underscore IP, the field equals 127.0.0.1, and those hyphens have been turned in or normalized into dots. And so now that information will be mapped onto the Cloud SIEM schema. And then finally, the record is going to be enriched with information from match list or threat intelligence databases, such as the threat level. And we haven't talked about that yet. We will further, but that's a really great feature of Sumo Logic as well. All right, keep going in here. Oh, did it skip? There we go. So what we're now looking at is now the record. So it's past that parsing enrichment step. It's now turned into a record. Each record is going to be ingested into Cloud SIEM, and it's going to be compared to hundreds of built-in and custom rules. We'll talk about how those rules get in shortly as well. But if a rule triggers, an entity is going to be extracted, and then a signal is going to be created. If a record matches the criteria specified in a rule, then Cloud SIEM is going to create that signal. The severity that's going to be provided is going to be a number between 1 and 10. That is going to tell Cloud SIEM how serious the potential threat is. When a signal is created, it's going to contain a name, an entity, a severity, a stage, and a description. A signal is always going to contain, at a minimum, an entity and a severity. Now, what's an entity? I've alluded to this a few times. The entity, sorry, keep jumping ahead. The entity is in the signal is going to be something like an IP address, a MAC address, a host name. It's basically going to tell us who or what was involved in the event that the record described. And the entity is going to be extracted from the record. Every signal will have an entity. And then the entity's activity score is going to be the sum of all those severity scores of all the signals it appears in. So basically looking at all the times the entity shows up, adding those scores together, and that's going to trigger something. We'll talk about what it triggers shortly. Now, the signals portion. Oop, there we go. So Cloud SIEM is going to take everything one step further and then correlate these signals into insights, and a manageable number of insights, which is really important. An insight is going to be a group of signals that is clustered around a single entity. An insight is going to be created when the sum of the severity scores of signals with the same entity goes above a certain activity score within a certain time frame. By default, that time frame and that activity score is 12 within the last 14 days. So if there's more activity, a higher activity score than 12 within the last 14 days, that is going to trigger an insight. But that is customizable, but that is the 12 and 14 days is the default. So for example, if a rule was triggered with a severity of 5, and then 10 days later, another rule with the same entity and a severity of 5 was triggered as well, the total activity score would only be a 10 in the last 14 days, so an insight would not be created. However, if those same two rules had a severity score of 6, then an insight would be created because it would then be 6 plus 6, which would be 12, and that would be that activity score. Once an insight is created, then you can start in a security investigation and start to take actions like alerting SOC teammates or executing playbooks. Now, I wanted to show, it keeps loading my extra portions here, but that's all right. Now, this is a image of the interface. We're going to look at this more closely. We'll get hands-on with it pretty soon, probably within yeah, pretty soon, 5-10 minutes, actually sooner. But I wanted to describe this because this is the insight radar. Now, the entire data pipeline can be thought as a funnel with your log messages going in on the top and the insights coming out the bottom. And so while you might ingest millions of logs, you're only going to get a few hundred signals and hopefully, or ideally, maybe a handful of insights. The insight radar, which is what I'm showing here, that's going to be in the Cloud SIEM UI, relies on this funnel shape from a top-down perspective. And as you go towards the center, there's going to be fewer items. So what we're seeing here on the outer ring in this blue lines here is going to represent the records that have been ingested. So the dark blue line is showing the relative number of records in the last 24 hours. So like a clock, we have kind of midnight starting, and then we go around the ring. So what we see here is there's been kind of a normal amount of records, and then at 4 a.m. it was a bit of a spike of records. And so these spikes and dips represent the times where more or less records than average were ingested. Now, next we have the middle circle, which is these bars. What this is representing are the signals that are generated from the records. Each bar represents the number of signals generated at that time. So what we see here is we had a lot of signals, here we had a little bit less, a little bit more, but we're starting to get some insight into that. Now, the innermost circle, that's really what we're mostly interested in, because this is going to represent the insights that have been correlated from those signals. Now, a triangle can represent 2 or more insights if they were generated at the same time. And we'll see that hands-on in a moment. But wanted to show this, really show this. All right, let's see. All right, let's log into the training environment. So we're going to start with those labs. So like we did yesterday, let me go ahead and set this up for you again. We're going to use the same credential methodology we used last time. So, and if you didn't join us last time, that's fine as well. So we're going to go to service.sumologic.com. That's going to be the URL to log in. The email we're going to use is training+analyst number, and I want you to select a 3-digit number, any 3-digit number out there. If you used one yesterday, I'd probably encourage you to use the same one, although it really doesn't matter. If somebody else is using the same numbers, it really doesn't matter. But once you get logged in, go ahead and as Heyman has already started, put your 3-digit number in the chat just so I can kind of know that you're with us. The password also is holiday21, so capital HOLIDAY, excuse me, 21 exclamation point. So go ahead and log in. I'll give everybody a moment or two. I'm going to log in as well. And before I log in, or not necessarily before, but concurrently, I actually need to provide you with a lab guide. So let me go ahead and just find that. Here it is. Sorry, I should have had this set up earlier. All right, let me put this into the chat here. Okay, so in the chat should now be a PDF. I think it went through. Yeah. That looks very similar to this. So ideally what we're going to have is we're going to have our instance of Sumo. Let me log into there. We're going to have our lab guide, and we're going to have our Zoom open and anything else you might need. Let me just log into a training account so that we're on equal playing level. All right, so I'm logged in and I have my lab guide. All right. So what we're going to do is just go through the lab guide. Lab 0 is where we're going to start. Very straightforward with lab 0. It's really making sure we just logged in as we did. Let's see, it looks like some people are having a little problem finding the PDF in the chat. I think I can provide an alternative here. Let's see, let me just give me one moment here. I think I can fix this. Or one more moment here, sorry. All right, I just put a link. I just put a link in the chat for a site called SlideShare. Excuse me, SlideShare, hard to say. And that should host the PDF as well. In fact, let me show you what that page looks like. So you should get this page and this interface. It's a little, well, it works. It's probably, the UI is a little funky, but it does work. So, and so what we're doing now is we're doing lab 0. Excuse me, wait, I gave you the wrong one here. Hold on. This is the wrong, sorry. The right, let me, hold on. The PDF in the chat is correct, but the slide share, let me give you the other link. Sorry, this is the new slide share one for Cloud SIEM fundamentals. Sorry about that. So hopefully you see you're using that second slide share link or the PDF I posted earlier. And hopefully we're all together. So I apologize if we're not, but I think we're okay now. I don't see anybody screaming. So I'm gonna assume we're all together here. So let's begin with these labs here. So lab 0, as I was mentioning, we're gonna log in, but then the other portion of lab 0 is viewing the Cloud SIEM enterprise environment. So as we see when we log in, we're given the environment that we saw yesterday. We can do a new log search, all this stuff. But what we want to do today is we want to utilize Cloud SIEM. And so to get to Cloud SIEM, what we're going to do is go to the bottom left of the black bar. If it's hidden, just click on the 3 lines. And we're going to choose Cloud SIEM Enterprise. And when we do, fingers what you should get, I need to re-authenticate into my VPN. I'm not having a good day here. I apologize. This should have been done earlier. What you should get, though, is the Cloud SIEM environment. And I hope some of you are starting to see that. And let me try this again. There you go, finally. So what you should ultimately get is to this screen, which shows this insight radar as described earlier. So hopefully everybody's looking at this. If somebody can just confirm that they're looking at this just to make me feel better, that would be great. And we'll once we're all kind of together. Good. All right, cool. All right, thank you. So just good. All right, funny. Good. You guys are on it. Cool. All right, so I'm going to alternate a little bit from slides and labs, just because that's the way I'm supposed to do this. But let's go, let's start to just explore. So lab 1 is all about having us explore this new environment to us. And we're going to go through it, but let's kind of explore it at a higher level, or let me kind of talk through it. And so this is the Cloud SIEM enterprise environment. So like yesterday, you're in a training environment, and feel free to go around and click stuff. You can't break anything for the most part. No, you really can't. So, certainly we're going to go through these labs together, but if you want to start clicking and doing something else, that's perfectly fine. You're not going to really break anything. So what we're looking at here is it's the main page. The middle section is showing us this insight radar, which I described earlier, and now we'll play with it together in the labs. And on the left-hand side of the screen, what we're starting to see here are the records, the signals, and the insights. And this right here gives us a pretty powerful image of what the system's doing. Essentially, what's happening here is the system has ingested 638,000 records. So this is over the last 24 hours. Of those 638,000 records, it found 4,000 signals. Of those 4,000 signals, it found 3 insights. So over the last 24 hours, the system is basically telling us there's 3 things we should look at. It looked at, for us, 500,000 records, but it's distilled it down into saying, these are 3 things we should check out. And that's pretty cool. That's pretty helpful. That's showing me what I need to look at. And we're going to do that shortly. And that's where we're headed to with the lab. Another thing I just wanted to mention about the Insight Radar itself, this middle panel, actually the whole interface really, is it's meant to evoke a gaming style or interface. So like you see in popular games, it's this heads-up display. It's meant to have that same imagery. The person that created this not created it completely, but worked on World of Warcraft. And so it's meant to have a video game feel, which I can relate to personally, and I think many of us can. And so just wanted to kind of mention that. I think it's just a neat little fun fact. So let's go ahead and look at Lab 1 and start to play with some of the features. Now, Lab 1, particularly Lab 1, Step 1, it gets a bit repetitive, but let's go through it anyhow. So what we want to focus on here is, like I was pointing out, this portion right here and the time. By default, it's going to be set to the last 24 hours, but we can customize that. And so first portion of Lab A is how many records have been ingested in the last 8 hours. And so what we could do, change the time from 24 hours to 8 hours. And now everything recalculates. And so now we see how many records have been ingested in the last 8 hours, 200,000. And once again, 200,000 records, 1,000 signals, and just 1 insight. So over the last 8 hours, almost 250,000 records and one thing that we should pay attention to. How many signals have been created in the last 7 days? Take the time, the last 7 days. And once again, the scale of it, 4 million records, 21 insights. And then how many insights have been created in the last 24 hours? Once again, just kind of going back here, 24 hours, and then that's the numbers we kind of started with in the first place. So for how many insights, it would be 3. On the left-hand side of the screen, we're also going to see the status of these insights. So in this case, we have 3 statuses that are new. We're going to have the ability to modify these statuses as we'll do soon, kind of soon. And then we haven't gotten into this, but you can start to see these insights. We're going to, but feel free to click around. And so in this example of those 3 insights, if I start to click on these, I start to get shown what is being flagged, what is being triggered. We're going to get into that together, but just wanted to show that if, like I said, if you want to start poking around. All right, so let's go ahead and let's just get back to the lab. The other thing to point out, I think it actually is one of the steps. It actually was in step lab 0. I should have pointed it out. If at any point you get stuck in this environment, if you click on the Sumo on the top left, it will take you to this HUD as the main page. So just a good way to get home in the enterprise environment. All right, so what we're doing here is starting to just utilize the HUD itself. And so, for example, in the last 24 hours, what time were the most records ingested? So here we're using the records, which is represented by the blue and the outer ring. And so we see the most amount of records were ingested at 3 a.m., at least on mine. So your time zones, I don't even know what they're going to show, but they should, it should be right about here. MITRE ATT&CK framework, yes, we'll talk about that. So good question. Let's see, when were the fewest records ingested? So same idea, the fewest records were ingested right here, represented by the dip. What time were the most signals created? So for signals, we're looking at these rings. And so the most signals would be, I guess this guy right here, since it has the highest height. Let's see, and then how many insights have been generated in the last 24 hours? Once again, they're shown here. Keep in mind, I mentioned this, it's not that, I mean, it's important enough to mention again, but the amount of triangles does not necessarily equate to the number of insights. So you could have 3 triangles and have 4 insights. This one could have 2 insights. So although we're kind of led to believe that there's 3 triangles, for the total number of insights, we should just kind of rely on the number there. And as you notice, or may have noticed just a moment ago, the system is constantly refreshing. So every 30 seconds, it's going to kind of pulse and refresh, which is helpful as well. All right, what we're going to look at next is the top navigation bar, content, and then rules. So content and then rules. And what we're going to see in these rules are the rules that have been created in the system. So either, in this case, they're primarily generated and created by Sumo. So of these 645 rules, 640 of them are probably Sumo rules that have been created, but you can also create your own. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's what we're starting to see in here are these rules that have been set up. And so when criteria match them, then the severity score will be applied. And then if that severity score gets high enough in a period of time, then a signal can be created, an insight can be created, and that all that kind of that path that we were looking at earlier. What I want to show you here is the filtering using the filter for the rules. So here we have our rules, and we can use a filter that's built in right here. And this filter is going to allow us to look for specific rules. So for example, how many rules have a name that contains firewall? What we can do is we can use the filter and say name either contains or matches or is, probably contains. Actually, firewall. Although I should have really done name contains. Either way, it should get this many. And so what we're doing now is we're looking at just those 4 rules that are larger related to the firewall. All right, so there was a request to go into PDF. The only to go into full mode. The only thing is I have my PDF. Let me see. I'll just keep it on a different window. I think we should be all right. All right. So let's see. So now we're looking at the filter. And what we're going to do here is just kind of play around with the filter. So the first part was the firewall. If we want to find all the rules that have a severity score greater than 8. So what I'm going to do is just remove my filter there. And now I'm going to create a new one. And so in this case, I'm going to do severity greater than, and just pick my value of 8. And so I should get, and you should get, I think there's 5 rules. It's being a little sluggish. It's normally left 3 rules there, 3. And so now we're just using the filters. Let's see, question, can the columns be sorted based on specific columns like severity? Yes. Yes, you can. So here is the ability to do so. So you can also, so yeah, you can do it right there. All right, let's see what else. Oh, and then how many rules have the persistence attack? And we'll talk about persistence a little bit later, but for that tactic, if we wanted to look for that, we could do, let's see, I always mess this one up. Not type, tag, contains tactic, persistence. Oh, and I still have my 8. Let me get rid of that. All right, and so then this should have 99 rules. So we're just showing you how to use the filters, which is going to be quite important to filter. Let's take a look at the entities next. So this is going to be step 4 of lab 1. So the entities are going to be those who or what, those identifiers, the IP address, the computer name, the username, the host name, that's going to be in there. And so that's what we're starting to see is the system has found or identified, in this case, all these different unique or, well, each one is unique, entities. So we see IP addresses, usernames, host names, etc. We can go ahead and use our filters here. So if we wanted to look for all the entities that have a activity score greater than 5, and so then we should see these 4, entities. And so we see the activity score, and then once again, we can sort by those couple of fields. If we wanted to look for all the entities that have a activity score of 0, so activity score is 0. Not really showing you anything super new with filters. I know you all know how to filter, but it's important enough, I guess, to show you and remind you that they exist. All right. Let's see. Oh, and then as I mentioned earlier, to get back into the HUD, if you click on the Sumo icon on the top left, that will bring you back into heads-up display. All right, so let's go ahead and let's go back to the slide deck, and then we'll do just a couple of slides, and then we'll get back into lab 2. All right. So back to the slides. Okay. So in lab 1, we looked at the summary stats, we looked at the Insight Radar, we looked at the built-in rules, and so we'll talk about those rules a little bit more specifically shortly, but we saw those rules that were created, or like it says, built in, and then we looked at the entities that were being tracked or identified. Now what we want to do is get started with threat investigation. So we want to review some threat investigation best practices and how Cloud SIEM can help here. So we have some different use cases. Here are 3 that we've come up with. We have financial logic. So in our use case story, financial logic is a major player in the banking industry. and they meet all the GDPR and other international compliance standards, but they worry that their big investors are still targets for hackers. So Financial Logic is concerned about hackers. Sumo Pharma. This is going to be a healthcare company that ships prescription meds to patients. While they meet all the HIPAA standards and guidelines, they're concerned about data privacy. So they want to monitor all their data to make sure their patients are safe and healthy in the digital world. Sumo Coffee. This is a small retail business with a big tech idea. They want to automate the entire coffee business from bean to cup. So in addition to consumer protections like PCI DSS, their main concerns include keeping computing costs down while their startup grows. So these are 3 different scenarios that we can utilize, and we're going to use one of these shortly. Now, before we do, I want to talk about threat investigation and threat hunting. Threat investigation is reactive, while threat hunting is proactive. Typically, threat investigation happens in response to an alert. And once you've investigated a threat, you can then hunt for similar threats and take precautionary steps to prevent attacks from happening again. Threat investigation is an iterative scientific process, much like troubleshooting. In both threat investigation and troubleshooting, you first are going to monitor your system. Once an anomaly is detected, you're going to make a hypothesis about how it happened and diagnose the problem. And as you dig deeper, you may revise this initial hypothesis and find more clues about why or how the attack or error happened. And so as you investigate and trace the events, you're going to try to answer these type of questions. Who is behind the event? What assets did the event affect? Where did the event occur? When did the event occur? Why did the event occur? And then finally, how did the event occur? Once you've started to ask these questions or get answers to these, you can take action to resolve the issue. There can be many actions you can take in response to an incident. For example, you might want to work with your IT team to isolate and wipe laptops that have been infected with malware to prevent spread of malicious code. Or you might work with your HR team to enforce mandatory anti-phishing training among all employees to prevent future attacks. Now, what I want to show next is a day in the life of a SOC analyst, especially using Cloud SIEM. Now, some of you are in this role, and so you can probably relate to this, and I want to show you how Cloud SIEM can help your day. Because Cloud SIEM is going to be able to help with every step of the threat investigation process. So Cloud SIEM is first going to automatically detect and monitor potential threats by analyzing millions of records and distilling them down into a handful of insights with a low false positive rate. And you can choose the insights from the homepage of the Cloud SIEM in the Insight Radar as we start to look at. Once you choose an insight, you can start to dig through all the raw logs and signals to conduct deep dive investigations and even proactive threat hunts. We didn't get that deep yet, but we will, and we will. So we'll start to look at what is shown in those investigations and what's displayed in the signals. Now, once you started to look at this, you can organize your thoughts, you can make hypotheses, you can take notes about your investigation in the comments of each insight. This is going to allow you to share your ideas with your SOC teammates and help you keep track of your investigation. You can also take certain actions directly from the insight. You can email teammates, create JIRA tickets, execute playbooks, and many other custom actions within the action buttons. Finally, you can update the insight. You can mark it in progress or closed. When you close it, you can mark it as resolved or false positive or duplicate or no action. And updating the status correctly is going to help the Cloud SIEM Insight Engine produce more accurate insights for your org in the future. So it's going to kind of learn off of that. And then, of course, this process will repeat each day as new insights are generated for you to investigate. Now, another topic that somebody asked about earlier or brought up earlier, I guess, is the MITRE attack. You may be familiar with MITRE, you may not be. I was not until I started working on this project, so that's okay. But it is fairly well known. What I'm talking about here is this thing called the MITRE attack matrix. And MITRE is a nonprofit research organization. And the way they spell attack is not the way you normally spell attack with an ampersand in there. The reason they spell it that way is trying to be kind of a little bit creative, but what it stands for is adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. And so what this framework or this matrix does is it basically organizes and categorizes these tactics and techniques that criminals and scripters and adversaries use. It's going to include attacks like exfiltrating databases, installing malware, stealing credentials, all these nefarious activities that you and your SOC team are trying to stop. And so Cloud SIEM is going to use these same tactic names for the stages of signals and the name of insights. Once you're familiar with this attack matrix and framework, navigating Cloud SIEM's insight pages become easier. I'm going to go and paste a link into the chat to the MITRE page if you're interested. So certainly if you do know MITRE, it's going to help. If you don't, you're going to kind of learn it as you're using Cloud SIEM. So you'll be kind of learning a new skill, I guess, as well. But it is a pretty helpful way of identifying things. And we'll look at those things shortly. We're getting into the example here. So let's go ahead and now start to look at some of these MITRE attack use cases and how Sumo Logic is going to help us with them. So which MITRE attack tactics and techniques might our companies that we were just talking about earlier, might they prioritize? So for example, we have our financial logic company. They were concerned about keeping their clients' data secure. So for them, credential access is a concern, since all customers have user credentials tied to their financial accounts. So credential access is a MITRE attack tactic and technique, and that's one that financial logic is concerned about. For Sumo Pharma, for example, they're concerned about patients' privacy and data and compliance with standards like HIPAA. Exfiltration of private data is their major concern. And so exfiltration is a tactic and technique, and that's the one that they prioritize. Sumo Coffee, they want to make sure that their infrastructure is running as efficiently as possible. Their infrastructure and their apps are running as efficiently as possible. And so execution is going to be a particular concern because many executables are going to use precious computing resources. Now, threat investigation with Cloud SIEM. I think I'm missing a slide. There it is. So the insight page is going to show us everything we need to start unraveling the security event. So when our signals cluster together, Cloud SIEM is going to use these or use their tactics and techniques to name the insights they generate. So this is the system doing it, not a human. The insight's name can ideally, or not even ideally, can point you to how the event occurred or why the adversary is behaving that way. For example, a tactic name like discovery or persistence shows the reasons the adversary has. Similarly, tactic names like initial access or execution can tell us a little bit about the methods the adversary used. These names are just starting points, however, and we may need to revise our hypothesis as they continue. So if we have, for example, we have an insight named credential access, what do we know about it? Well, it's probably related to some sort of credential access. The system is pretty accurate in its naming. And so when we get into our examples in a few moments, we'll actually see that. Now, the timeline is going to be helpful for us. This image, it's a little hard to see that it's just really blue. Just a lot of blue on there. But what you hopefully can see is the timeline kind of on the bottom half of the screen. And this is going to tell us when the event occurred. It's also going to show us whether each signal was triggered at the same time or sequentially, or as well as whether everything happened over minutes, hours, or days. Remember I mentioned earlier, by default, insights are related signals that cluster together within the last 14 days. And so we can have signals that occurred several days together or clustered more closely together. And that's kind of what we have here, is a little bit of both, to be honest. So what we have here is a timeline from about, let's say, the 1st to the 13th, so 14 days. And what we see here is on the first day, there was a rule that was triggered. We see about a week later, there was a rule that was triggered. And then about another, 4 or 5 days later, a few more that were triggered together. So that's interesting. If they had all 5 of them had happened in the same hour, that might also be interesting. And so the system is letting us know about this. And so having a timeline and understanding what took place when is going to be critical. Now, I mentioned these entities, and I'm going to mention them again. And once again, these entities are going to help us point to either who or what or where the event occurred. That entity is going to be potentially an IP address of a hacked device. It could be the location of an adversary. It could be the location of a database that was leaked, an owner of a website. Each insight is only going to have one entity that is clustered around. So it's going to have a single, whether it's that IP address or what have you, that is going to cluster around. All right. So hopefully that makes sense. What we're going to do now is we're going to jump into lab 2. So in lab 2, what we're going to do is we're going to select one of the insights. As you'll see in the lab guide, there's actually 3. We'll pick one. You feel free to do the other 2, just we don't really have time to do them together. But if you want to do them during a break or later, feel free to. And then we're going to look at that insight and navigate it and see what's there. So here is here are our options. So we can pretend or utilize financial logic. Oh, whoops, actually, that's the recap. We're going to do that right now. Sorry, I went one step ahead. So let's go ahead and jump back into our lab guide. So here's my lab guide, but I'm going to keep it kind of on hidden. I'm going to go ahead and jump back into Sumo. Hopefully I didn't get timed out. Yeah, I think I'm okay. And now in lab 2, what we're going to do is choose, and I'll make my screen full screen again for whoever mentioned that earlier. That was a good suggestion. We're going to go ahead and select one of these. So let's do, it really doesn't matter. Actually, let me do 2A and then let's do 2B together. I think we have time to do both. So I'm going to go ahead and do 2A, and you can do it with me, of course. And then 2B, we'll do a little bit. Well, we'll do it as well. We'll do both. We have time. So 2A, we're going to go ahead and do financial logic. So what we want to do now is we want to go into the insights, and we want to look for a specific insight. The insight we want to look for is called persistence with initial access. You should see one in here. You should see a bunch in here. There's many of them. You can also search for them. So as it suggests in the PDF, I can go ahead and search for the name. So as we see here, pick one. Yeah, it doesn't really matter which one. Now, what do I see in here? Well, I'm going to see a lot in here. So let's go through this. So this is the insight. So what we're now seeing is the insight. We see the entity. So here is the IP address that everything is revolving around. We see, what else do we see? We see our timeline up here. What we see here with the timeline is an event happened, and then a bunch of events happened much later. We see the events that happened. So here we see these events in chronological order, although there is a little issue with it, but I'm not going to point it out. I'll see if somebody else finds it. And now what we see is what occurred. So what occurred here? So we see these different events. A device IP matched a threat intel file hash. A user received an email with a phishing link. Checkpoint found that a malicious file was allowed. And then CrowdStrike did a detection. So what happened here? Essentially, as it says, well, it does provide us the steps here. Essentially, what happened is our user, our recipient here of Vagrant, received an email. And yes, the alert timing is not in order. That's correct. And it should be. So that's the issue here. But the story still should be kind of similar in that the user received an email with a phishing link. A few minutes later, an email or a file was allowed through the system. So a few minutes later, that file came through. Then CrowdStrike went ahead, and this is using the threat intelligence, detected that a zip file with a malicious file hash was occurring. So here we see the file base name, and here we start to see the list that it matches. This also had a very high activity score. This is a big deal. And then ultimately, as mentioned, the times are a little not in order, but then ultimately what we see is the device IP matched the threat intel file hash. And so essentially, this caused the insight to create. Now, what should happen, as it says here, the financial logic should lock this user account, re-image their machine, train them not to click on phishing links, whatever you kind of do to take care of that, to handle that, whether it's training, whether it's enforcing things within the system, what have you. Now, the other thing we can do here, I don't know if it has us doing these as steps. Yeah, it does. So what we would do now is we could do an action. So of our actions here, we have many different triggers we can trigger. Do we want to create this and turn it into a JIRA ticket? Do we want to send it through PagerDuty, through ServiceNow, Slack, etc.? Many different options. And then we can close the insight. And I mentioned this earlier, providing a resolution is going to be important because the system is going to learn based on the resolution you put here. So you want to put something that's appropriate to what's happening. All right, so let's go ahead and let's do, yeah, we have enough time. Let's work on, or not work on, but let's do lab 2B together. So this is going to be Sumo Pharma. They were concerned about exfiltration with credential access. So what I want us to do now is go back to Insights and look for exfiltration with credential access. If you see one in there, just kind of sticking out, grab that one. Otherwise, just do a search and there should be some in there. Go ahead and grab one. And so once again, here we have the same idea. We have the entity. So in this case, it's a host name, not an IP address. We have our events, our timeline here. And then we start to see here these things that have been triggered, these rules. So we start to see there was a guard duty unauthorized access. There was a guard duty instance credential exfiltration. There was a guard duty related to pen testing, and then a high traffic volume. So what we're seeing here, and I should really kind of pause and ask you, what do you see here? But the lab leads us to what we see here. So I'm just going to kind of let the lab guide us. And so what we're seeing in the summary is unauthorized access occurred in the form of credential exfiltration. So here is the unauthorized access for that credential authorization. We see the severity here. So this was a pretty severe event. Now, what we see a little bit later is guard duty is oh, actually, it's this one here, sorry. This guard duty right here is detecting that penetration testing is taking place, so that this Kali Linux user is doing some pen testing. A few hours later, the system notices an unusual high amount of traffic on AWS's US East 1 server. And so since Sumo Pharma is proactive in looking for these vulnerabilities, there was a consultant that was performing penetration testing. And basically that's all that was happening here. This was a penetration test. Now, if you had done some investigation and you talk to some of your peers or whatever, and they say, we don't do penetration testing here, that this could be a hacker. But since we know this is part of an exercise that was just happening, we can go ahead and provide the resolution properly and close the insight properly. And so we can go from having our hypothesis of being a malicious hacker to identifying, no, it was actually just some penetration testing. And this is the system doing it for us. The system is identifying that this was a pen test, that there was a high amount of traffic volume. And so that's great. The system is doing all this for us. All right, let's see. Let me go back to my slide deck just to make sure we're kind of together. Oop. I think we are. Yeah. So let's go ahead and just deciding if we should take a break now. We could take a break now. Let's see. Why don't we go through? Yeah, let me just run through these couple slides here. Then we'll take a break before we do the next lab. So just a few slides here. Well, it's not too bad. I guess you can decide how bad it is. But what I want to talk about here is, as it says, deeper dive into the investigation. Question about creating rules. We will not be discussing that in this class. That's the administration class, where they actually we'll talk a little bit about rule tuning. So yeah, stay tuned for that. The monitoring portion though here. So insights are going to provide a great high-level summary of the potential security events, but sometimes you're going to need to dig or investigate deeper and to really understand what's going on. And so this is where the signals tab is going to help. The signals tab is going to list all the signals created by the rules that have been triggered in your system in the last 14 days by default. So signals are going to provide summaries of potential security threats. Not all signals are security incidences, because there could be a legitimate reason why someone's logged in from 2 different devices at the same time, or why there's several failed password attempts on an account. That doesn't necessarily mean malicious hacker. When you click into a signal, you're going to see the option that has the full details of the records that triggered it, which is going to include the information like the IP address, the geolocation. And then you're also going to have that entities tab, and we saw that a few times. About the entities tab listing all the entities. And we'll talk about that scoring again. We'll talk about it a few times here today. Let's see what here. The context actions. Actually, we'll talk about this. Let's take a break now. Let's do our break now. We'll come back and talk about the context actions, a few other things, and then we'll get into lab 3. So now's a good time. So let me go ahead and let me just get my timer here. Let's do like we did yesterday. Let's do a 15-minute break. We have enough time, and we won't be running too late. So, all right. So we're going to go ahead and take a break. Come back, do a few more labs, a few more slides, and then we'll start talking about the exam as well. So I'm going to go ahead and throw myself on mute. But if there's any questions, if there's a couple, go ahead and just add them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll answer them once we get back. So thank you, everybody. Come back, we'll finish it up, and we'll get you out of here. So thanks, and see you all shortly. Yeah, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had a good little break, good little snack, whatever it was. But now what we're going to do is jump back into where we were. So let me go ahead and yeah, let's just continue here. So I'm going to go back to my slide deck and talk about a few things, and then we're going to get back into labs. So there we go. So what I wanted to talk about here was the signals and entities. We went over this earlier. We actually saw some of the entities already, so we've seen this a little bit. Context actions. I don't think I showed, no, I didn't show the context actions yet. So insights are going to be giving you a great high-level summary of potential security events. Because Cloud SIEM's threat intelligence and sophisticated correlation engine, very few insights are going to be false positives. So they're really going to be all worth investigating. However, sometimes you may want to investigate deeper to identify or really understand what happened. Or you might want to be proactive in your threat hunting work to find potential problems before they begin impacting your system. The Signals tab is going to list all those signals created by the rules. The entity, actually, there we go. So what we're going to talk about here are these context actions, and these are going to be found throughout the Cloud SIEM UI. These are going to be helpful for the in-depth investigation. As you see here in the screenshot, this is accessing these context actions. So by going to the details and clicking on, trying to wait for it to load, the icon that has 6 little dots, this is going to allow us to do these context actions. These context actions can be things like inserting the entity into an API call, doing a DNS lookup with them, and other tasks. Now, something else we can do with our context actions is utilize Sumo Logic Search. An in-depth threat investigation is really going to use the most of both Cloud SIEM and Sumo Logic's core tools. There's going to be several ways for us to bring the information we find in Cloud SIEM back to the Sumo Logic platform. One context action is what we call Sumo Logic Search, and this image is showing it pretty accurately. Basically, we're taking that IP address, we're using the 6 buttons there, and then we're going to the action for Sumo Logic Search. Now, this next screenshot is even more accurate in showing what we're about to do in lab 3. So what we're doing here, though, is we're using the Sumo Logic Search context action and taking this IP address and bringing it into Sumo Logic. And that's, like I said, what we're about to do right now. So let's go ahead and let's see. What else? Oh, and then finally finish the investigation. So I started to show this as an example. I should have really waited. I was getting a little ahead of myself. But when we want to finish the investigation, we're going to use the actions. We're going to close the insight, and we're going to do some of that now. So like I said, I showed that earlier. Just got a little ahead of myself. I was a little too eager. All right, so let's go ahead and now, oh, so jumpy today. Now we're going to go ahead and do lab 3. So we're going to go ahead and grab our lab books and go into lab 3. Now for this one, we're going to just do lab 3A. I'm trying to pick back up a little bit of time, and 3B, it gets a little repetitive. So let's do 3A together. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of my slide deck. Let's see, I may have gotten kicked out of Cloud SIEM. Yeah, so I may have to log back in with my Training Plus analyst again. So please do that. I'm going to go ahead and put those credentials back into the chat just for those of you that forgot them, which is fine. So once again, we're just logging in with those Training Plus analyst credentials if we got kicked out, which we probably all did. And I should have mentioned it. right, so once we get logged back in, we go back into Cloud SIEM Enterprise. And now we're going to go ahead and do lab 3A. So we're going to go ahead and go back to that persistence with initial access insight that we were looking at earlier. So we're going to go into our insights. We're going to probably just search for it. If we see it pop up right away, that's fine as well. So I'm going to grab one of them. And now once this loads, now we're going to use the entity, which is this IP address. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this entity and look it up in Sumo Logic Search. Now we could just copy and paste the IP address, of course, but we want to make it a little more fancy, a little more integrated. So what we're going to do, click on the 6 dots, excuse me, here, and go to Sumo Logic Search. It's also in red, so it's really should kind of stand out. And when we do, we're now running a query, and we looked at running queries yesterday. And what we're seeing here now is for the last 15 minutes, this IP address has been found about 3,000 times. We see the IP address highlighted down below. We see the source category and then other stuff. But now we're utilizing going back into the Sumo Logic backend. Now, what we're going to do here next, as it says, is do another query. This query is going to be actually similar to one we ran yesterday because it's going to have transpose. But I want to show you the query. It's important enough to show you. So let me go ahead and highlight it here. And let me do a new log search. So I'm going to do a new log search. I'm going to paste the query. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this IP address. And, oh, and I should have this on full screen, sorry. And I'm going to put this in right here. Now, when I run this, and you may need to modify your quotes. Sometimes pasting from a PDF doesn't paste as well as it should. So I just needed to redo my quotes. I think that's why. Yeah. And there's no results. That's a little weird. Just go further back. Okay, so now I get some results. So what I did here is did a search. Actually, we tell you to do the last 24 hours. And what we want you to do is we want to look at the messages. And what we're doing here, why we're doing this, is to produce some information related to this IP address. So what we're saying is look for this IP address and look through the all the records that were ingested into Cloud SIEM for this IP address. When you find that IP address, count the vendor and the product and transpose this data. That's what we're getting in the aggregates here. But what we're starting to see here is essentially where this IP address is showing up in relation to other things in the system. It's showing up related to proof point. And if we go to the aggregates, we get a better kind of visual of this. It's showing up in CrowdStrike. And so we're starting to get potentially some understanding about this IP address, whether it's bad or good. Now, once we've kind of made our assumptions about this, we can go ahead and finish this investigation up. And so this is where we can go back into Cloud SIEM and now go ahead and use our actions, use our status, and close the insight. So we would say here, okay, the status is closed, the resolution, this has been resolved, or whatever, whatever might be appropriate here. And then we can go ahead and close the insight. We also see here, and this is, let me show, I didn't show this earlier, and I should have. The signals allow us to go even deeper. So earlier we were looking at the signal here related to like the user phishing email link. By clicking on this, we get much more granular information about what actually was triggered. We see the threat reference URL. We see the mappings, the extracted fields. We just get a lot more information. Sometimes more information can be overkill. Usually not, usually it's helpful, but we start to get that when we go into the signals themselves. So I just wanted to show that. Yeah, just wanted to show that. All right. So that should conclude lab 3A. Cool. So now what I'm going to do is go back to the deck, and now we're going to go over a couple slides, and then we're going to do lab 4. And 5 and 6. All right, so let me go back to my deck here. So lab 3, we played with, we set the status. Now I want to talk about, so a few slides here, talking about rules and customizing the environment. This is something someone else asked about earlier, but many of you are probably thinking about it. And so let's go ahead and talk about customizing Cloud SIEM. Now, Cloud SIEM rules, what are they? Once you've completed a few investigations, you might want to modify or add rules, data sources, match lists, other things to Cloud SIEM. And these modifications can help reduce false positives or alert you even faster. The most common thing to customize are going to be rules and insights. Rules are going to be one of the most important pieces of Cloud SIEM's threat investigation or threat detection engine. All the records that are ingested into Cloud SIEM are going to be compared to every rule that's in Cloud SIEM. Remember, records are just normalized log messages. If there's a match, an entity is going to be extracted and a signal is going to be created. Those entities are tracked and may correlate with other signals and create an insight, which is where most of our threat investigations are going to begin. Now, there's a couple different custom file types or custom rule types, excuse me. And you don't have to write your rules from scratch. The Sumo Logic content team creates and maintains hundreds of out-of-the-box rules to get you started. And we looked at those rules earlier when we went to rules, and there were 645 of them or so. Those were the ones that Sumo Logic or someone at Sumo Logic has created. Sometimes you need to write a new rule from scratch. Sometimes you don't, but let's talk about when you do. You might need to do this if your system has a resource that isn't covered by the default rules, or you're looking for a threat that isn't covered by the default rules. Custom rules are not updated or deleted by Sumo Logic during the regular updates. They're going to be independent from the default rules. So you can go ahead and create custom rules or rule tuning expressions, and these rules will not be modified or deleted by Sumo's regular updates. So there's 4 types of rules. The first one is going to be a match rule, and this is the most simple rule. It's going to be a simple Boolean statement, essentially checking if it's true or false. If it's true, then an entity will be extracted and a signal will be created. So for example, you might want to simply look at whether an IP address matches another one that's on a banned list. Now, a threshold rule, a little more complex. Threshold rules are going to be triggered when a match is found on a certain number of times. So for example, if 1 failed login attempt is acceptable, but 5 is not, then a threshold rule would fire after the 5th failed login attempt. Chain rules. These are going to fire or occur when certain different events happen in a certain time window. For example, if you want to look for 5 failed login attempts followed by 1 successful login within 1 hour, then you'd use a chain rule. And then finally, there's aggregation rules. These aren't used very frequently, but what these allow you to do is be triggered, or not you, but they will be triggered when up to 6 different events accumulate over time. So if you wanted to create a rule that looks for a large number of event types from a single device IP, then aggregation rules would be used. But like I said, they're really just not used very frequently. Now, this is a blank rule template in Cloud SIEM. 2 sides here. You have your left and your right side. your if and then and your thens. So when a rule is configured, you're going to, or excuse me, when a rule is created, you're going to configure the condition it's going to match. And this is going to be a short piece of code that's going to depend on the rule type you're creating. It's basically an if statement. You can also add, there we go. You can also add rule tuning expressions, which are going to be small exceptions to rules that are appended with an end statement. Now, once you've set the conditions of the rule to fire, you can configure the signal that will be created. This can include details like the name, the entity, the description, as well as the MITRE attack tactics and techniques you're looking for with your rule. And then finally, you're going to configure the rule severity score. This is going to be on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the most severe. You can choose a severity of a 0 if you want to monitor something, but not necessarily create insights. Higher severity scores are going to be more likely to trigger insights. Now, the best practices for these custom rules. First, you want to check the existing rules in the system. As I mentioned, Sumo Logic has hundreds of built-in rules, and so you may not need to write a new one, or you may only need to make small changes to an existing rule. You don't need to create a new rule, don't do it. You need to know your system well. You need to understand the schema and log mappings of the records ingested into Cloud SIEM to write effective rules. And so you may need to work with an administrator that has more of this information when creating rules. Oop, keep jumping. You want to know about your company's risk tolerance, their risk appetite, and their priorities. And so what do we mean by that? So let's say we have a company that wants to monitor a large amount of outbound traffic, and they don't consider it a threat. So they monitor outbound traffic. It's not a threat, so they assign a rule a severity of a 0. Another company might be alarmed by a large amount of outbound traffic and consider it data exfiltration. They might mark the same rule as a severity of 5. Which is correct, a severity of a 0 or a severity of 5? Well, it depends on your organization. And that's what we mean by that risk appetite or priorities. It's important that you know and understand all the types of rules. If you are using a use case that requires a chain rule, but you write a threshold rule, that rule might not be as effective. This is probably more general best practice than just for Sumo, but making small changes and testing them. So when you create a new rule or edit an existing one, make small changes. So for example, if you want to take your severity score and decrease it from an 8 to a 2, maybe don't go that drastic. Maybe change it from an 8 to a 7, and then monitor the change for a while and see how that's going. And then another best practice is saving all new rules as a prototype. And this is going to allow you to monitor the rule's behavior without creating new insights and alerts. And so we'll be doing this as a best practice. It's basically like running a prototype, a test version, if you will. All right, a few more slides here. Actually, yeah, a few more here. So talking about rule tuning. Adding a rule tuning expression to an existing rule is really one of the easiest and most common ways to customize your rules. A rule tuning expression is an end statement that you add to an existing rule. And it's usually going to be simple logic you add to rules. With rule tuning, you can modify existing rules without rewriting them from scratch. Once you've written a tuning expression, you can apply that tuning expression to multiple rules. You can also apply multiple tuning expressions to each rule, so there's flexibility there. We're going to learn how to apply one tuning expression to multiple rules. And we're also going to learn how to apply multiple tuning expressions to one rule. So we're going to look at both of those today. When you use rule tuning instead of custom rules, your tuning expressions are retained when Sumo updates that rule. So you can take advantage of the rules that Sumo pushes out to all its users. Once a rule is in the system, whether it's a custom rule that you created or one that Sumo created, Cloud SIEM is going to use it to create signals. If a record matches a rule, an entity is going to be extracted from the record. And that entity, remember, is that IP address, a username, a domain name. It's telling us who the potential threat is. Once an entity is in Cloud SIEM's system, Cloud SIEM then tracks the total severity score of signals associated with each entity as an activity score. Once that activity score gets high enough, which is going to be 12 by default, then an insight is created. So what I'm going to talk about next is that scoring system. And we have a pretty good visual example here. I think it's pretty good. So let's take a look at it. So what we have here is, as it says on the left-hand side of the screen, let's say we have 13 signals that are currently in our system over the last 2 weeks or from the last 2 weeks. Each shape or color is going to represent a different signal. So what we have here are signals that have an entity of A. Those are going to be our pink triangles. We have our green squares. Those are going to be entity B. And then we have our blue circles. Those are going to be entity C. Based on the rule that fired, each of these signals is going to have a severity score, and that's going to be represented by the number in the shape. Now remember, by default, an entity needs an activity score of 12 before an insight is created. And the activity score is going to be the sum of all those severity scores from the last 14 days. So here we have 3 pink triangles. They have a severity score of a 5, a 6, and a 7. We have 4 blue circles. They have severities of 1, 1, 2, 2, and 3. Actually, there's 5 of those. Then we have the green squares. We have 5 of those. We have those of a severity of a 1, a 2, a 2, a 3, and a 4. Now the question is, which of these signals, which of these colors or shapes are going to cluster together into an insight? The pink triangles, the blue squares, the green square, pink triangles, green squares, blue circles. None of them, some of them. So let's go ahead and see. And I'm glad to see some of you are not guessing, answering rather. So let's see together. So entity A, let's talk about those pink triangles first. Those are going to cluster together into an insight. Even though there's only 3 of them, they have a relatively high severity score. The total severity score, or the total activity score rather, excuse me, for entity A, the pink triangles, is 18 because it's 5 plus 6 plus 7. Now let's talk about entity B, the green squares. These also cluster together into an insight. Now here the scores are pretty low, 1s, 2s, 3s, but there's a bunch of them. And so they add up to 12. And so 12 is that baseline. So that's an insight. Now entity C, those won't cluster into an insight quite yet. Cloud SIEM is going to track those entities, but the activity score there is a 10. So until another rule of severity with a severity score of 2 or higher triggers with that entity, it's not going to cluster into an insight. So what we want to show here is the fact that you can have a large number of low severity score signals that don't create an insight. You can have a small number of high severity score signals that do create an insight. And so you want to keep that in mind when you're starting to customize or configure the severity score for your custom rules. All right, I think we got 2 more slides here, maybe 3, but they're pretty quick. Custom insights. So what if you want to be alerted right away when a certain rule is triggered? Or you don't want to use the default activity score of a 12. This is where a custom insight is going to help you. A custom insight is going to let you create an insight based on one specific signal or a chain of signals, regardless of the severity scores. It's going to be great for known threats specific to your system. And you don't need to change any of your existing rules and insights, so they keep working normally. All right, and then finally, not finally, but just in regards to I guess finally, with the Cloud SIEM's out-of-the-box rules, there's really 3 ways, or 3 simple ways to customize the Cloud SIEM rules and insights. The rule tuning expressions, which are going to be those simple ways to add small exceptions. The custom rules that let you write logic that's unique to your system to cover threats or data sources that aren't covered by built-in rules. And then finally, those custom insights that we just talked about that allow you to get alerts based on just one rule or chain of rules. And what we want to do now is we want to go back to the lab guide and create some different rules. So what we're going to do now is lab 4, 5, and 6, where we're going to write a rule tuning expression. We're going to create a custom match rule, and then we're going to create a custom insight. And so that's going to be how we're going to wrap things up today. So let's go ahead and do these. So I'm going to go ahead and get back into Sumo. I'm going to get back into my lab guide, have it here, and kind of away we go. So lab 4 is where we're starting with creating a rule tuning expression. To do so, we're going to go to the top of the screen, assuming we're on the heads up, actually any screen, it should, as long as we're in, yeah, as long as we're in here, it shouldn't matter which screen. We should be able to get the content and rule tuning. Now, when we get into rule tuning, we might see some rule tuning expressions that have been created. Here we see a couple, possibly by one of you guys right now, which is fine. And what we're going to do here now is we're going to create one. So we're going to go ahead, click on the top right, and click create. When we're creating these, we want you to use, as it says in the lab, for the name, go ahead and use your initials and the number you're using. So for example, here we're going to create a tuning expression. So I'm going to call it 234. Actually, I'm going to call it JV234. And now we're going to essentially kind of fill in the blanks here using the lab. But what we're going to do here, and I'm sorry, I should have actually read this portion of lab 4. And in this scenario, what we're doing is we're updating some of the firewalls in our system, and we don't want to trigger unnecessary alerts. So what we're doing here is we're creating an expression that will allow us to bypass firewall related rules. And so I should have mentioned that before we got into the rule tuning expression itself. But now that we're in there, we want to set up that firewall rule. So what we're going to do is we're going to tune selected rules, and we're going to type a rule to add. When we type a rule, we're going to look for our firewall rules. And so specifically, we want to look for this network firewall alert training. Once again, we're messing around here, so it doesn't really matter which one you select, although I'd encourage you to select the one we're supposed to. And now we can go ahead and modify this with a rule tuning expression. What we're going to do for our rule tuning expression is we're going to provide our user email for the training analyst number. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that or copy that from the PDF. I'm going to do that again. There we go. I am going to need to do a few things here. I'm going to put my number. I'm going to put 234. And then I also need to go ahead and modify the apostrophes. If you notice in the screenshot, the image, the email address is red, and here it's white. And this is once again just the artifact of pasting from a PDF. So I'm just going to modify these. And now it's red. Now, we are using the not here. So that's what this exclamation point is acting as a not operator. And so what we're doing is with this rule is allowing us to trigger as long as the address is not ours. So if it's our address, that's okay. If it's not our address, then we want it to trigger. And so what we're going to do is just click submit. Assuming you get to this and it says the rule tuning expression has been created successfully, you should be complete with this lab. But we can verify by going back to content, going back to rule tuning, and I should see the new ones in there. There we go. So there's mine. And I hope to see at least someone else joining me in there. Oh yeah, here, the TNC one, perfect. All right, so now we create a rule tuning expression, and that's pretty easy. What we want to look at now is the custom match rule. So this is going to be lab 5. So in this scenario, kind of a different scenario, as it says in the lab, we're concerned about traffic coming from a particular IP address that's not covered in the default rules. And so what we want to do is we want to create a match rule that looks for a specific IP address. So to do so, we're going to go back up to content, and this time we're going to go to rules. Under the rules, we're going to see all the rules that have been provided by Sumo Logic or that have been created by you or whomever. Most of them are Sumo Logic ones. Now we can also create our own, and that's what we're going to do right now. Go to click on create, And now we need to choose the type of rule. And remember, we went through this earlier. The match rule is more of a Boolean statement. The threshold is a threshold, and so on and so forth. For this first one, we want to do a custom match rule. And so we want to choose the match rule. And so we're going to click create here. And now, like we were doing, we're going to kind of fill in the blanks. So we're going to give this a name. So as we've done match rule, JB234. And now I'm going to have my if and my thens. So what I need to first define is the expression. So that's going to be the device IP equals 127.0.0.1. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it in there. I'm going to go ahead and modify those apostrophes again. And now I'm going to make this an add tuning expression. So what I'm going to do is click on add tuning expression. We're going to go ahead and select. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Let me go back here. Okay, so here I'm back in my match rule. And so now I'm going to go ahead and add tuning expression. And I'm going to look for my tuning expression that I just created. Now what I'm going to do is configure the signal. So the if side is if the device IP equals 127.0.1 and it's associated with my email address of training plus analyst number, then what do I want to have happen? Well, I want to create a signal. What signal do I want to create? Well, this is where I get to define it. I want to make my signal based on the entity, which is going to be that device IP. So that's going to be that important piece of information, is the kind of the who is the device IP. The name I can go ahead and specify, and for here it doesn't really matter. So signal JB234. The summary, the description, these we really doesn't, we'll just put test for now. And what we can now do is define the severity score. So when this occurs, is this a 0? Is it a 10? We can decide that. In this case, as the lab says, probably a 1 would be most appropriate, but we can put anything we want in here. Then what we can do is we can finish up with our tags. So this is where we can define the MITRE TAC framework that we want to have associated with this rule. So we're going to go ahead and select our tactic. And then we're going to select the tactic that's specifically associated with this one, which is going to be this initial access. Once we have that done, we are going to click save this rule as a prototype, and we're teaching you this really more as a best practice. And then I should, there we go. I should be able to submit. If I can't submit, I may have a little orange triangle here letting me know I'm forgetting some information. But in this case, I don't, which is good. So now I'm going to click submit. When I do, I should be brought back to this screen, which is really just confirming that it's there. And now also, if I go back to my content and rules, there should be a new rule for me. Let's see, what did I call it? So cool, there it is. And so there's my new rule. All right, now what we're going to do finally to wrap this up is create an insight. And so here, the reason why we want to create an insight is we want to be alerted right away, specifically when our custom match rule is triggered. So how do we create this insight? Well, kind of the same way we've been doing it. We're going to go ahead and go through content. And then we're going to go ahead and select custom insights. We're going to give ourselves a name. Looks like a few people are ahead. This is great. Always good to see. So we're going to go ahead and click create. And now we're going to give this custom insight a name. same numbering scheme or naming scheme we've been using. Now for here, for the signal that we want to add, we want to locate that rule that we just created in lab 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to type to add the rule. Let me see, when signals are created. Oh, rules, that's all. And now we're going to go ahead and grab that rule that I just used. There it is. Now for this one, we don't care about the order. And now we're just going to fill out the rest again. So we're just going to put a test. We're going to put our tags here. And then we're just going to click submit. And then now if we go back to content and custom insights, we should see our insight created. See a few of them. And now that insight should come into play. Not should, it will. Cool. All right, so that's primarily, let me go back to my deck, but that's really what we wanted to cover, at least through the lab guide and primarily through the slides as well. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, I really didn't. So what this was intended today was, like with fundamentals yesterday, an overview or the basics of the Cloud SIEM environment. Like with what we looked at fundamentals yesterday, you can get much deeper. There's the admin course and other things to start to get deeper into it. But this is meant to be a start. Hopefully this was helpful. I think it was. I'll let you kind of decide that. We are going to talk about the exam next. The exam very similar to the way we took one yesterday, but I'll go over that in a moment. But just want to kind of pause here, see if there's any other questions or anything really. Let's see, there was a question about with lab 5 and 6. So the difference I wanted just to point out here. So lab 5 was allowing us or telling us how to create that custom match rule, so that we are looking for a specific IP that's not in our default rules. So we needed to create a new rule or a custom rule. And so that's what we're doing in lab 5. And in lab 6, we were creating a custom insight. So when that rule was triggered, we want to be alerted right away. We don't want to wait until it gets to be a severity score of a 12 over 14 days. And so that's where we're creating that custom insight for us. And so using those two together gets us alerted more timely. All right. All right, let's talk about the exam next. So we're going to take one. So as we did yesterday, we're going to take an exam. Some really very similar ground rules. 20 questions, 60 minutes to take it. You need a 70 to pass. I think yesterday was a 75. And then once again, it's going to be open resource and specifically open documentation. So once again, I'd encourage you to use the documentation. Not even encourage you. You should. By not using it, you're doing yourself a disservice. But with the documentation, and I guess let me share a link to get you to it. Actually, Cloud SIEM. And so let me paste this in. This is going to be a good starting point. But similar to yesterday, all the answers or virtually all the answers can be found in the documentation. And so I think everybody did pretty well yesterday. So I'm hoping for that same level of involvement today. Let's get you into the exam. So as a reminder, we don't want you taking the exam as the analyst. We don't want training analysts 2, 3, 4 getting credit for the exam. We want you. And so we want you to log out of that account, log in with your new one. This might be repetitive from yesterday. In fact, I hope it is, but if not, there might be a few new people here. Once you've logged in as yourself, you're going to go to certification and you're going to choose get certified. Now, I don't think I'm going to have, I don't have it here, so I can't show it to you. I'll log in with another account to show it to you. In fact, let me do so. Nope, that didn't work either. And if you know where to go to start taking it, please start and just put me on mute and ignore me. There we go. So we log in, we go to home, we go to certification, we go to get certified. And then we go to get certified in the Learn portal. Under Get Certified, we should have many exams. And the one we want to take today is Cloud SIEM Fundamentals exam. So this one right here. Go ahead and click on it. And then same as yesterday, register for free. Once again, with our exams, there's no charge to you or your employer. It's free for everybody. And then once again, start, read the stuff, which is the same thing I just told you. Go through the exam. And then submit all answers. And just, I want to remind you again, so once you take the exam, you're going to get a score. You're going to do better than that 0, but then you want to submit the results so that you get credit for the exam. Then once you're done, you should get that certificate as well. And then that's what you want to send to us. So as a reminder, yeah, this is the same one for today. Once you're done with the exam, done with the certificate that you get that, then go ahead and send it to training-promotions@sumologic.com. Make sure you put your email address and your job title. We need that for, I don't know, for legal reasons, for some reason. And then we'll send you a $10 Swiggy voucher. And so you're entitled to 2 of those, one for yesterday, one today. So you have actually unlimited amounts of attempts to take it. I know it says it only shows 1. I don't really know why it says that. So you can take it multiple times. You can also take it multiple times now, not now. So I'd encourage everyone to take the exam right now because we've set aside the time and we're here and all that. But if you can't, you can go in later. One other question I saw that was answered in the chat, but just for everybody's awareness is you can also use these credentials for these labs through the rest of the month. And if you want the latest credentials, just go back into the certified page anytime in the future. And here are going to be those credentials that you can utilize. So starting in January, we'll probably have new passwords and you can still participate. So feel free to use those lab environments. Keep in mind they are lab environments. They get cleaned periodically, deleted, things like that, but they are great to use. So I think I'm going to shut up here. I want you to, focus on the exam, but I do want to thank everybody for attending. We had a really good turnout. You guys asked questions in the chat, which was great. It always makes it more fun for me. And thank you for Poonam and Ashwin for helping with the questions. But yeah, once again, thank you for attending. Please send in for the gift card. And I'll leave that slide up. I saw there was a question as well about the recording. I believe we'll be sending a recording out probably next week, just due to tomorrow being Friday already. I doubt we'll get it out by the end of tomorrow, but I believe early next week we should have one for both days for you. So you'll get those as well. So thank you again. Like I said, I'm gonna put myself on mute, and good luck on the exam. Thank you for attending, and hope to see you at a future class. You guys were fun to work with. So thank you again.
Hi, Josh. You were saying something. Sorry, I went to just grab a glass of water. Tell me.
No. So we're just wrapping up, Poonam. So just wanted to thank everybody for attending, and yeah, I think we're gonna let everyone take the exam, and I think we're good.
Okay. Thanks, Josh. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you all.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Guys, we will be winding up in 4 minutes. So if you have any questions, do share. And all the best for the exams. Okay, team, we will end the session now. Thanks for your time and all the best. Do share your certificates across. Josh, you there?